Hey you guys, I'm going to read out loud topic 5, evolution, and while I do that, I'm going to be underlining important information and making annotations next to the text. Topic overview. Extensive evidence indicates that life on Earth began more than 3 billion years ago. Fossils found in ancient rocks have given us many clues to the kinds of life that existed long ago. The first living organisms were simple, single-celled organisms. Over time, more complex single-celled creatures developed. Then, about 1 billion years ago, increasingly complex multicellular organisms began to appear. The idea that explains how this change in species has occurred over time is known as evolution. Bolded word. So I'm going to underline the definition that goes with it. The theory of evolution. The theory of evolution is accepted as the central theme of modern biology and helps biologists understand how the variations among individuals can lead to changes in an entire species of an organism. Since it was first suggested by Charles Darwin, the concept of evolution has been refined by massive amounts of evidence offered by thousands of scientists. So much evidence has been collected that evolution now has the stature of a theory, confirmed in many different ways, and can be used by scientists to make predictions about the natural world. So I'm going to say that a theory is confirmed. The theory of evolution helps biologists understand the similarities, such as bone structure and biochemistry, among different organisms. It also helps to explain the history of life that is revealed by the fossil record, which is a collection of fossils that provides clues to the history of the Earth's organisms. The fossil record spans much of geological time, the billions of years of Earth's history, revealing many changes in environments as well as species. Figure 5.1 shows examples from the fossil record through geological time. Evolution does not necessarily produce long-term progress in any set direction. Instead, evolutionary change appears to be more like the growth of a bush. Notice in figure 5.2 that some branches survive from the beginning with little or no change. Some die out altogether. Others branch repeatedly, with each new branch representing a new species. Number 1. Evolution is the process of development of one-celled organisms from mammals, change in species over long periods of time, embryonic development of modern humans, or changing energy flow in food webs. Number 2. Which phrase best defines evolution? An adaptation of an organism to its environment, a sudden replacement of one community by another, the isolation of organisms from each other for many years, or a process of change in species over a period of time. Number 3. The study of fossils has allowed scientists to describe past environments and the history of life, study present ocean temperatures at different depths, analyze the chemical composition of sedimentary rocks and minerals, or describe the details of the process by which life first began on Earth. Number 4. The evolution of a species is often represented as a branching tree similar to the one shown in the diagram below. The names shown represent different groups of organisms alive today. The lines represent their evolutionary histories. The statement that is best supported by the diagram is that Annelida and Arthropoda have an ancestor in common. Echinodermata are more closely related to mollusca than they are chordata. Mollusca and Arthropoda evolved before Porifera, or Annelida and Arthropoda evolved from Echinodermata. Number 5. The diagram below represents possible lines of the evolution of primates. Which inference can be best made based on the diagram? Remember, an inference is a guess, but that guess has to be based just on data from this diagram. Is it 1, adaptations for living in trees are inherited by all primates? 2, humans and apes have a common ancestor. 3, the embryos of monkeys and apes are identical. 4, the period of development is similar in most primates. The mechanics of evolution. Darwin did not only suggest that species evolved, he also suggested how the evolution might have occurred. Darwin thought that the mechanism of evolution was like the process of artificial selection practiced by breeders of plants and animals. He used the term natural selection to indicate that the process of evolution was controlled by nature rather than by people. In the process of natural selection, individuals that survive are able to breed and pass their genetic information to the next generation. Those that are not as successful in the environment often die without leaving any offspring. Overview of evolution. Darwin's ideas are easy to understand. In any environment, an individual may be born with a characteristic that makes it stronger, faster, any sort of advantage that will help it survive and reproduce. The individuals that prove to be the best adapted to their environment will most likely survive. If they do survive, their favorable characteristics will be passed on to many of their offspring. As a result, these useful adaptations, which first appeared randomly, are likely to become more and more common with each generation. Similarly, characteristics that reduce an individual's chance of surviving and reproducing will tend to decrease over time. The long-term result of natural selection is a change in the frequency of certain traits in a population. Beneficial traits tend to become more common. Harmful traits tend to become less common. As the frequency of a trait in a population increases or decreases over time, it can be said that the species is evolving. Note that the population, not the individual, changes as a result of evolution. An individual does not evolve. Each is born with genetic information that may or may not help it survive and reproduce. As natural selection leads to changes in composition of population, the population may have more individuals with a certain favorable characteristic than it did earlier. So, evolution means good traits will survive and be passed on. Interactions in evolution. The driving force behind evolution is the interaction between individual organisms and their environment. Conditions that are vital to the process of evolution include the potential for a species to increase its numbers, known as overproduction. So I'm going to put a plus sign next to overproduction so I know increase. The finite, limited supply of resources needed for life, the genetic variation of offspring due to mutation and genetic shuffling, the selection by the environment of those offspring better able to survive and reproduce. All these conditions, which are explained below, are involved in the process of evolutionary change. Overproduction. In each generation, a species has the potential to produce more offspring than can possibly survive. Species with high reproductive potential include bacteria, insects, dandelions, and rabbits, see figure 5.4. If all the offspring of these organisms survived, they would overrun Earth. However, that does not happen. Scientists have learned that in stable environments, the population of a species remains about the same from year one to the next. For example, no matter how many deer are born in 1 year, at the same time the next year, there will be about the same number of deer as there was the year before. Similarly, some fish species lay millions of eggs, but by the next year, the population of the species is the same as it was in previous years. This happens because not all new individuals that are born or hatched will survive to adulthood. The struggle for survival. Overproduction leads to competition among the members of a species. Not all offspring survive long enough to reproduce. In many cases, chance determines which offspring survive. For example, wind may blow a dandelion seed to a patch of fertile soil or into a lake. A deer may be born in a wildlife preserve or in the path of a forest fire. But chance is not the only factor that determines which offspring will survive and which will die. The offspring will have to cope with environmental conditions such as temperature, disease, parasites, and predators. They also need resources such as oxygen, water, food, and shelter. However, the supply of these resources is finite. If they are to survive, organisms of the same species must compete for limited resources. I'm going to underline that. Depending on their success as competitors, individuals will get the resources they need to survive, or they will not. Those that are best suited to their environment are more likely to survive. Many of the losers in this struggle for resources will die before they have a chance to reproduce. Variation. The new traits that can lead to evolution come from normal variation within a species. As shown in Figure 5.5, organisms within a species are never exactly alike. For example, some adult grasshoppers have longer legs than others. Some have a lighter body color. In any group of gray squirrels, some have sharper or longer claws. Lighter or darker fur, bigger or smaller ears, and so on. The differences among offspring are due to genetic variation. The unique combination of traits each organism inherits from its parents. Some variations give individuals an advantage over others in their struggle for resources. Any trait that helps an organism survive and reproduce under a given set of environmental conditions is said to have adaptive value. So I'm going to underline that. I'm just going to put a note over here that adaptive value helps survival. For example, a rabbit's ability to blend in with its surroundings may allow it to escape capture by a fox. The coloration it inherited has adaptive value for the rabbit, allowing it to escape predators and survive. When the fox population is high, this adaptation may be especially valuable to rabbits that inherited it. Selection by the environment. As Darwin proposed with his idea of natural selection, traits with an adaptive value in a specific environment give individuals in that environment a competitive advantage. If the beneficial trait is passed to the offspring, they too are more likely to survive and reproduce. The proportion of individuals with these characteristics, will increase because they are better able to compete than individuals without the beneficial trait. Eventually, nearly all the individuals in the population will have the beneficial trait. This change in the characteristics present in the population over time is evolution. Although some evolution may occur without much change in the environment, it is usually the adaptation of a species to changes in its environment that brings about evolution. Therefore, a changing environment is often the driving force for evolutionary change. Number 6. The process of natural selection is based on the assumption that environmental changes will cause changes in body structure in individuals. 2. Most changes from generation to generation are the result of mutations. 3. Part of the population of organisms always remains stable. Or 4, different traits inherited by offspring have different survival value. Base your answers to questions 7 and 8 on the information below and your knowledge of biology. A study of beetles on an isolated oceanic island formed by volcanic action and far from any other land shows that all the beetles that are presently on the island are incapable of flying. A study of fossils from different rock layers of the island shows that the island was once populated with flying beetles. The graph below shows the probable change over the last 5,000 years. Number 7. The loss of flying ability by the beetle is most probably the result of 1. Predators eating the beetle's wings. 2. Beetles not using their wings. 3. Genetic changes in the beetles. Or 4. Lack of vegetation for the beetle to feed on. Number 8. The graph indicates that the non-flying beetles probably 1. Were better adapted to the environment. 2. Arrived from other islands 5,000 years ago. 3. Mutated and produced flying beetles. Or 4. Became extinct about 1.5 thousand years ago. Number 9. When lions prey on a herd of antelope, some of the antelope are eliminated. Which part of the theory of evolution can be used to describe this situation? 1. Asexual reproduction of the fittest. 2. Isolation of the species. 3. Survival of the best adapted. Or 4. New species development due to mutation. Number 10. Every spring, each mature female fish of a particular species produces several million eggs. However, the total population of this species remains at around 10,000 from one year to the next. State 2 reasons why the fish population remains approximately the same from one generation to the next. Number 12. The organisms of population A and population B are now incapable of interbreeding and producing offspring. Which biological process most likely caused this situation to occur? 1. Artificial selection, 2. Cloning, 3. Natural selection, or 4. Asexual reproduction. Base your answers to questions 13 and 14 on the information and graph below and on your knowledge of biology. Scientists studying a moth population in a wooded area of New York State recorded the distribution of moth wing color as shown in the following graph. While observing the moths, scientists noted that moths spent most of the day resting on trees and looking for food during the night. The woods contained trees with a bark color that was predominantly brown. Number 13. A fungus infection affected nearly all trees in the woods so that the color of the tree bark was changed to a gray-white color. Which graph shows the most probable result that would occur in the distribution of wing color in this moth population after a long period of time? 14. As a result of fungus infection, the change in moth wing color distribution would most probably occur by the 1. Production of sex cells by mitosis, 2. Natural selection of favorable variations, 3. Eating of pigments and fungus spores, or 4. Production of mutations as a result of eating the fungus. Sources of variation. As you may recall, the arrangement of an individual's DNA bases determines all of the inherited characteristics of the individual. Any change in bases or their sequence may bring about a change in the individual, but not all of those changes can be passed on to the individual's offspring. In sexual reproducing organisms, only changes in genes of sex cells can be passed on to the next generation and become the basis for evolutionary change. Other types of variation, such as changes to the body cells, die with the individual. For example, a father who built huge muscles due to exercise does not pass those large muscles on to his offspring. So, I'm going to make a note of this. Only changes to sex cells pass on. There are two major ways an organism can wind up with genes that differ from those of its parents. Some genetic variations arise because of mutations in the genes of an organism. Others are due to genetic shuffling, the routine sorting and recombination of genes that occurs during sexual reproduction. Mutation. A mutation is a change in the base sequence of a DNA molecule. Mutations occur as random chance events that cannot be predicted. Some mutations occur as errors in DNA as cells function. Radiation and some chemicals can also cause them. Mutations are an important source of totally new forms of genes. When mutations occur in body cells, they affect only the individual. However, a mutation in a single-celled organism or in the sex cells of a multicellular organism can be passed on to the offspring. In organisms that reproduce sexually, only mutations in the genes of sex cells can become the basis for evolutionary change. And we made note of that already. Nearly all mutations are harmful and may affect the offspring so severely that they cannot survive. A few mutations benefit the individual, however, and can increase its chance of surviving, reproducing, and passing the mutation to the next generation. A beneficial mutation may lead to the evolution of a new species. For example, the ancestors of polar bears probably had dark fur. If a mutation resulted in a bear with white fur, that bear probably would have died young. However, if the mutation occurred in a snowy environment, the white fur would have been a useful mutation, allowing the bear to stalk its prey more effectively. Genetic shuffling. The sorting and random recombining of genes during meiosis and fertilization results in new and different combinations of genes. So I'm going to put here Differentiation, because that's what leads to differentiation. Those genes can be passed on to the individual offspring. The process is similar to shuffling and dealing cards. The deck stays the same, but nearly every hand will be slightly different because of mixing and rearranging during shuffling. At fertilization, even more variety is introduced because now cards from 2 decks are combined. Although mutations provide new genetic instructions, genetic shuffling is the main source of the variation that exists among the members of any sexually reproducing species. Review questions number 15. Which statement is basic to the theory of evolution by natural selection? 1. In general, living organisms maintain a constant population from generation to generation. 2. Changes in living organisms are almost completely the result of mutations. 3. Natural variations are inherited. 4. There is little competition between species. Number 16. Which statement is not included as part of our modern understanding of evolution? 1. Sexual reproduction and mutations provide variation among offspring. 2. Traits are transmitted by genes and chromosomes. 3. More offspring are produced that can possibly survive. Or 4. New organs are formed when organisms need them. Number 17. The modern theory of evolution states that a basis for variation within a species is provided by 1. Mutations, 2. Asexual reproduction, 3. Cloning, or 4. Overproduction. Number 18. Sexual reproduction is related to evolution because sexual reproduction, 1. Occurs only in more recently evolved forms of animal life, 2. Increases the chances of extinction of different species, 3. Increases the chances for variations to occur, or 4. Is the more usual kind of reproduction. Number 19. Mutations can be transmitted to the next generation if they are present in hormones, gametes, body cells, or muscles. Number 20. A new chemical was discovered and introduced into a culture containing 1 species of bacteria. Within a day, most of the bacteria were dead, but a few remained alive. Which statement best explains why some of the bacteria survived? 1. They had a genetic variation that gave them resistance to the chemical. 2. They were exposed to the chemical long enough to develop a resistance to it. 3. They mutated and became a different species after exposure to the chemical. Or 4. They absorbed the chemical and broke it down in their digestive systems. Number 21. Which characteristics of a population would most likely indicate the lowest potential for evolutionary change in that population? 1. Sexual reproduction and few mutations. 2. Sexual reproduction and many mutations. 3. Asexual reproduction and a few mutations. Or 4. Asexual reproduction and many mutations. Number 22. Which 2 factors provide the genetic basis for variation within many species? 1. Asexual reproduction and meiosis. 2. Mutations and sexual reproduction. 3. Competition and the synthesis of proteins. Or 4. Ecological succession and mitosis. 23. Which statement best describes a current understanding of natural selection? 1. Natural selection influences the frequency of an adaptation in a population. 2. Natural selection has been discarded as an important concept in evolution. 3. Changes in gene frequencies due to natural selection have little effect on the evolution of new species. Or 4. New mutations of genetic material are due to natural selection. The results of genetic variation. The changes that result from mutation or genetic shuffling in the sex cells may affect the offspring in several ways. Most of the changes can be categorized as structural, functional, or behavioral. Structural change. The structure of any organism is the result of its species' entire evolutionary history. There are millions of examples of variations that have resulted in structural changes. For example, the polar bear, like other bears, has thick fur that keeps it warm in its cold environment. Polar bears have evolved an extra protection from the cold. The soles of their feet are also mostly covered with thick fur. This extra fur not only keeps their skin off the ice, but it also improves their traction. The theory of evolution has helped scientists explain many of the structural variations and similarities found in organisms. For example, in figure 5-6, notice that each limb has one thick long bone, two thinner long bones, and a hand with 5 digits. The ancestor of these animals most likely had a similar limb structure. At one point, however, limbs began to vary, evolving into arms, legs, wings, and flippers. Structures that are no longer used by modern organisms give scientists clues to the evolutionary history of the species. Some snakes, for example, have tiny non-functional leg bones, an indication that they probably evolved from 4-legged lizard-like ancestors. Functional change. Molecular or biochemical changes affect how organisms work. These are functional changes. For example, I'm going to underline that. Molecular or biochemical changes. For example, all working muscles emit an extremely tiny electrical output. In some eels, however, that electrical output has evolved into an adaptation that helps it find and capture food. The muscles of these eels can produce a massive shock that stuns or kills its prey. Changes in DNA often lead to functional changes. One example is a mutation in the DNA of certain one-celled organisms that led to their ability to make enzymes that digest wood. Another is the evolution of the ability of some snakes to make a poisonous venom. Behavioral change. Behaviors have also evolved through natural selection. Many of the specific behaviors we find in species today have become common because they resulted in greater reproductive success. I'm going to underline that. Fighting among the males of walrus population for a harem of females is one evolved behavior. Because of the fighting, the stronger, healthier male mates with the most females. The correct rate of blinking allows males and females of firefly species to find each other. A different pattern or rate of blinking would isolate the individual from potential mates. The importance of variation. If environmental changes occur, or if environmental conditions change, organisms that have adapted to those conditions may die. If all the members of the species had exactly the same combination of characteristics, an environmental change could be disastrous, wiping out the entire species. The variation of organisms within a species increases the likelihood that at least some members of the species will survive in a changed environment. Once the diversity present in a species is lost, it is next to impossible to get it back. Today's endangered species have such small populations that biologists worry that may not have the genetic diversity to adapt to even slight changes in their environment. Number 24. The changes in the foot structure in a bird population over many generations are shown in the diagram below. The changes can best be explained by the concept of natural selection, extinction, stable gene frequencies, or cloning. Number 25. Explain how the lack of genetic diversity found in populations of endangered species might hinder their recovery. Number 26. The Florida panther, a member of the cat family, has a population of fewer than 100 individuals and has limited genetic variation. Which inference based on the information is valid? 1. These animals will begin to evolve rapidly. 2. Over time, these animals will become less likely to survive in a changing environment. 3. These animals are easily able to adapt to the environment. Or 4. Over time, these animals will become more likely to resistant to disease. Number 27. Which statement could be used as evidence to show that two different species of organisms are most likely developed from a single common ancestor? They eat the same types of food. They have different digestive enzymes. They live during the same time period, or they contain similar amino acid sequences. Number 28. The diagrams below show the bones and the forelimbs of 3 different organisms. Differences in the bone arrangements support the hypothesis that these organisms, 1. Are members of the same species, 2. May have descended from the same ancestor, 3. Have adaptations to survive in different environments, or 4. All contain the same genetic information. Number 29. In most populations, the individuals that produce the greatest number of offspring are 1. Always the strongest, 2. Usually the best adapted, 3. Those that have only inheritable traits, or 4. Those that are the most intelligent. Number 30. The best scientific explanation for differences in structure, function, and behavior found in different species of organisms is provided by 1. Carbohydrate electrophoresis. 2. Population chromatography. 3. The theory of carrying capacity. Or 4. The theory of evolution. Patterns of change. Evolution appears to follow certain patterns that appear repeatedly in the fossil record. For example, changes in species are often related to environmental change. Species with short reproductive cycles that produce many offspring tend to evolve more quickly than species with long lifespans and few offspring. The failure to adapt to a changing environment may result in the death of the species. The rate of evolution. Most of the diversity of life on Earth today is believed to be the result of natural selection, occurring over a vast period of geological time. So I'm going to underline that. So evolution has to take place over a long period of time. The amount of change seems to be linked to changes in the environment. Minimal environmental change often results in stable populations. Rapid environmental change often lead to rapid changes in species. So I'm going to put over here a note. More environmental change equals more evolution change. However, for any species, it may take millions of years to accumulate enough differences from its ancestors to be classified as a new or different species. As shown in figure 5.7, some species have hardly changed in many millions of years. Others have changed so much that the relationships may not be obvious. The rate of evolutionary change may also be influenced by the number of offspring produced by a species. Those that have a few offspring and live a long time generally evolve quite slowly. Those that have brief lifespans and numerous offspring can change so quickly that evolution may occur in just a few years. One example of rapid change involves the evolution of antibiotic resistance by pathogenic bacteria. When a population of millions of bacteria is exposed to an antibiotic, there is a chance that a few might have a gene that makes them resistant to the antibiotic. This gene probably occurred as a chance mutation at some earlier time. It was most likely present in some of the bacteria before the antibiotic was used, and its appearance was totally unrelated to the presence of the antibiotic. The antibiotic could kill almost all of the bacteria except for a few that escape exposure to the antibiotic. The ones with the resistance gene would also survive. Because the antibiotic eliminated most of the competition, the few survivors, including the resistance ones, reproduce quickly, giving rise to a new population of the bacteria. In this new population, a higher proportion of individuals is now resistant to the drug. When the same antibiotic is used on the descendants of this new population, even more resistant bacteria will survive. Now the proportion of resistant bacteria is even higher. In this case, the antibiotic has become an agent of selection. The antibiotic did not cause the original mutation that made the bacteria resistant to the antibiotic. It merely determined which bacteria would live to reproduce. So I'm also going to put more offspring equals more evolution. Okay. Insects also have a short reproductive cycles and produce many offspring. Many insect species have changed significantly in response to pesticide use. For example, the widespread use of the pesticide DDT led to an insect species becoming resistant in just a few years. As was the case with bacteria and antibiotics, there may have been a few DDT-resistant insects, random mutation that had no adaptive value before the use of DDT. Once the DDT was sprayed, nearly all of the non-resistant insects were killed, leaving a high proportion of resistant insects to repopulate the area. Later, if DDT was sprayed again, it was less effective against the resistant offspring of the survivors of the earlier spraying. As a result of these kinds of rapid evolutionary events, we are finding more and more bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics and more insect species that are resistant to our pesticides. This has created many problems in the fields of medicine and agriculture, will continue to be a problem in the future. Extinction. Extinction is the disappearance of an entire species. Anytime the death rate of individuals within a species is greater than the birth rate, extinction is a possibility. Generally, extinction occurs when the environmental changes, temperatures change, sea levels rise and fall. Grasslands become deserts, clear lakes become polluted. The variation of organisms within a species increases the likelihood that at least some members of the species will survive the changing environment. In changing environmental conditions. However, when the adaptive characteristics of a species are insufficient to allow its survival in a new environment, the species will become extinct. The fossil record shows throughout geological time, millions of species have evolved, survived for a while, then failed to adapt successfully, and finally became extinct. It is a surprisingly common process, in fact. From the number of fossils of extinct organisms found, it is apparent that a majority of the species that ever lived on Earth are now extinct. Figure 5.9 shows a fossil of the extinct Archaeopteryx, an ancestor of modern birds. Review question number 31. The shark has changed very little in the last 50 million years. Which statement best explains why this is the case? The shark is well adapted to its relatively unchanged environment. Sharks have a high reproductive rate and show little change in their genetic makeup from one generation to the next. Sharks need change only if humans are present in their environment, or sharks have a high mutation and genetic recombination rate. Number 32. Fossil evidence indicates that many species have existed for relatively brief periods of time and have then become extinct. Which statement best explains the reason for their short existence? 1. These organisms lack the energy to produce mutations. 2. Humans modify plant and animal species through the knowledge of genetics. 3. These organisms lack variations having adaptive value. Or 4. Within these species, increasing complexity reduce their chances of survival. Base your answers to questions 33 through 35 on the diagram below and on your knowledge of biology. The diagram shows interpretation of relationships based on the evolutionary theory. The letters represent different species. Number 33. Explain why species B and C are most closely related than species A and C are. Number 34. The diagram indicates that a common ancestor for species C and E is species F, G, H, or K. Which species are least likely to be vital parts of a present-day ecosystem? 1. A and E, 2. C and D, 3. E and J, or 4. B and F. Base your answers to questions 36 and 37 on the information below and on your knowledge of biology. Joshua Lederberg discovered that in a large population of Escherichia coli, E. coli, about 1 in 10 million of the offspring was naturally resistant to the antibiotic streptomycin. When these naturally resistant bacteria were isolated and grown separately, they soon formed a large population. The entire population so formed was also naturally resistant to streptomycin. 36. The formation of the large streptomycin-resistant population is based on 1. Variations and survival of the fittest. 2. Mutations and asexual reproduction. 3. Sexual reproduction and no mutations. Or 4. Survival of the fittest and cloning. Number 37. According to the modern evolutionary theory, the resistance to streptomycin probably resulted directly from 1. Culturing the E. coli. 2. Changes in temperature under which E. coli are grown. 3. A change in the DNA of E. coli. Or 4. The presence of streptomycin in the environment of E. coli. Number 38. A large population of cockroaches was sprayed with a newly developed fast-acting insecticide. The appearance of some cockroaches that are resistant to this insecticide supports the concept that 1. Species traits tend to remain constant. 2. Variation exists within a species. 3. Insecticides cause mutations. Or 4. The environment does not change. 39. Compounds like the pesticide DDT may bring about the evolution of new strains of organisms by 1. Destroying food producers. 2. Acting as a natural selecting agent. 3. Mixing two different sets of genes. Or 4. Creating new ecological niches. Number 40. Some evolutionary pathways are represented in the diagram below. An inference that can be made from information in the diagram is that 1. Many of the descendants of organism B became extinct. 2. Organism B was probably much larger than any of the other organisms represented. 3. Most of the descendants of organism B successfully adapted to their environment and have survived to the present time. Or 4. The letters above organism B represent members of a single large population with much diversity. Number 41. Explain why changes in climate can result in the extinction of a species.